You know what I could never figure out in my shop? How to make something truly round without a lathe. I tried everything. Belt sander clamped to the bench, rasps, files, spinning a blank against a disc sander like some kind of backyard inventor. And every single time, I ended up with something that looked round from one angle and like a potato from another. Then about 3 years ago, I was visiting a folk museum outside Bergen, Norway, and I stopped at a display case full of carved wooden net floats. Some of them were over 1,000 years old, and they were round, not close to round, not sort of round, round, perfect spheres, carved entirely by hand, with nothing but an axe and a knife. No lathe, no jigs, no power tools of any kind. I stood there for a good 10 minutes just staring at them, trying to figure out how that was even possible. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how Viking-era carvers achieved geometric perfection with hand tools, step by step, the way I learned it. And stick around to the end, because I will show you a shadow technique for checking roundness that I now use on every piece of round work I do, not just spheres. Let us get into it. What we are really talking about today is a hand tool method for carving a perfect sphere that was developed out of pure necessity by Scandinavian fishing communities over 1,000 years ago. And what makes it worth your time is that the principles behind it apply to any round work you will ever do in your shop. Once you understand the progression, you will never look at a piece of round stock the same way again. So, let me start with where this comes from and why these people were so remarkably good at it. The Viking Age Scandinavians were not carving spheres as a parlor trick. They needed them. Wooden net floats were essential equipment for coastal fishing communities from roughly the 8th century through the 12th century and well beyond. Every net needed dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, and they had to be round enough to move through the water without tangling the lines. A lopsided float created drag, caught on the mesh, and cost you fish. So getting them right was not an aesthetic choice, it was an economic one. The blanks were typically birch, alder, or Scots pine, all abundant in Scandinavia and all workable green with edge tools. The finished floats ranged from about 2.5 inches to 4 inches in diameter, sometimes larger for deep water nets. Archaeological finds from sites in Norway, Sweden, and Iceland show these floats with remarkably consistent geometry. We are talking about spheres where the deviation from true round is less than 1/16 of an inch across the full diameter, done by hand, in a fishing camp. What I came to understand is that these carvers operated with a principle that does not get talked about much in modern woodworking. They did not try to carve a sphere. They carved away everything that was not a sphere through a systematic geometric progression that any patient person can learn. The skill was not in the hands alone. It was in the eyes, in the ability to read a shape from every angle and know exactly where the next cut needed to fall. That kind of spatial awareness takes practice, but the method itself is surprisingly logical once you see it laid out. So let me walk you through how they did it, starting with the wood. The first thing I learned is that Viking-era carvers were extremely particular about their starting material, and that selectiveness is the invisible first step most of us skip when we try to make something round. They preferred birch for most net floats. Green birch, freshly cut, with tight, even grain and no knots anywhere near the working area. Alder was a close second, especially in coastal regions where it grew right down to the waterline. Scots pine was used for larger floats, but required more care because of its resin content and wider grain variation. The blank was always split from a log, not sawn. Splitting follows the grain naturally, which means the fibers in your starting piece are continuous from end to end. That matters enormously when you are carving a sphere, because any runout in the grain, any place where the fibers dive sideways, creates a weak spot where your knife will tear instead of cut. A split blank gives you clean, predictable fiber direction all the way through. They would split out a piece roughly square in cross-section, just slightly oversized from the finished diameter they wanted. For a 3-inch float, the starting blank might be 3.5 inches square and 3.5 inches long. And here is something that took me a while to appreciate. They oriented the blank so the grain ran through the sphere in a specific direction, typically so the eventual borehole for the net line would pass parallel to the grain. That meant less chance of splitting the finished float when they drilled it, and better resistance to the constant swelling and shrinking the float would endure in saltwater. The second method in the progression is where the real magic starts, and it is also where I realized why my early attempts at round shapes always failed. I was trying to go from square to round in one step. The Viking carvers never did that. They went from square to octagon first, using a hand axe. You start with your squared blank, and you remove the four corners. That is it. You are not trying to make it round yet. You are just turning a square cross-section into an octagonal one. The cuts are made with a light Scandinavian carving axe, the kind with a relatively short handle, maybe 14 inches, and a blade ground with a single bevel. The blank is held against a chopping block or clamped in some fashion, and you take controlled, angled chops to remove each corner evenly. The critical thing here is symmetry, not roundness. You want all 8 faces of the resulting octagon to be roughly the same width. If they are, you are remarkably close to round already, even though the shape still has obvious flat faces. If they are not, if one face is wider than the others, that error will follow you all the way to the finished sphere, and you will never get it out. I tried this myself with a hatchet I already owned, and my first octagon was terrible. One face was almost twice as wide as the one opposite. But once I slowed down and focused on making each corner removal equal, checking the width of each new face before moving to the next corner, it started working. The axe does the heavy geometric work. You are not shaping a sphere with the axe. You are establishing the mathematical framework that makes the sphere possible. Once you have a clean octagon, you do it again. You take off the 8 new corners to create a shape with 16 faces. At that point, the blank already looks surprisingly round to the naked eye, even though you can still feel every flat if you roll it in your hands. That whole progression from square to octagon to 16-sided takes maybe 5 minutes with a sharp axe, and it removes the vast majority of the waste wood with a tool that is fast and efficient for bulk removal. This is where the axe work ends. Quick thing before we move on. Everything I am sharing today comes from years of studying how the old shipwrights built, and I have gathered the best of what I have found into a book called Secrets of the Shipyard. 16 chapters, 25 hand-drawn illustrations, 150 pages of real craftsmanship knowledge. Scan the QR code on screen or hit the link in the description if you want to take these lessons off YouTube and into your shop. Now, back to what I learned. The third method is where the axe gets set aside and the knife comes out, and this is where the Viking carvers really earned their reputation. The tool of choice was what we now call a sloyd knife, a fixed blade knife with a blade length of about 3 to 4 inches, a single bevel or a fine Scandinavian grind, and a handle shaped to fill the palm. These knives are still made today in essentially the same pattern, and if you have ever held a Mora 106 or similar carving knife, you know the type. The carver uses 3 primary cuts to take the 16-sided shape toward true roundness. The first is a slicing draw cut, where the blade is pulled toward the body with the thumb of the holding hand braced on the back of the blank for control. This is the workhorse cut for removing the remaining flats. The second is a thumb push cut, where the blade is pushed forward with the thumb of the knife hand pressing on the spine of the blade. This gives tremendous control for small, precise removals. The third is what I have heard called a chest lever cut, where the knife is held with both hands and the handle is braced against the chest, and the carver pulls the blank into the blade rather than moving the blade into the blank. This sounds awkward, but it gives you incredible power and control for slightly larger corrections. What struck me most, watching a traditional carver work, was how small the cuts were at this stage. Each pass removed a shaving barely thicker than a sheet of paper, and after every 3 or 4 cuts, the carver rotated the sphere slightly and checked it from a new angle. The rotation was constant. The checking was constant. It was not carve for a while and then check. It was carve, rotate, look, carve, rotate, look, in a continuous rhythm that became almost meditative to watch. The fourth method is really the heart of the whole system, and it is the one that changed how I think about round work entirely. Viking-era carvers did not use calipers. They did not use templates. They did not use any measuring device at all to check the roundness of a sphere. They used their eyes, and they trained those eyes deliberately. The technique works like this. You hold the sphere at arm's length and slowly rotate it against a light source, a window, a fire, the sky. As the sphere turns, you watch the way light plays across the surface. A true sphere produces a highlight, a bright spot reflected from the light source that moves smoothly and continuously as the sphere rotates. If there is a high spot, the highlight jumps. If there is a flat, the highlight stretches and distorts. If there is a depression, the highlight disappears momentarily. I was deeply skeptical of this when I first heard about it. It sounded like the kind of thing that works if you already have 40 years of experience and does not work for anyone else. But I tried it. I carved a rough sphere, held it up near my shop window, and slowly rotated it. And I could see it immediately. The high spots were obvious. The flats were obvious. It was like the light was drawing a map of every error on the surface. I went back and cut where the light told me to cut, and within maybe 15 minutes of careful knife work, I had a sphere that was closer to true round than anything I had ever turned on my lathe. I am not exaggerating. The traditional carvers also used shadow. In low, raking light, they would set the sphere on a flat surface and examine the shadow it cast. A true sphere casts a perfectly circular shadow regardless of its orientation. If the shadow shows any elongation or irregularity, the sphere is off. Between the rolling highlight technique and the shadow check, they had a quality control system that required zero tools and cost zero money and worked better than most of my gauges. The fifth method covers finishing, and this is another area where the Viking approach completely overturned my assumptions. There was no sandpaper in 9th century Scandinavia, obviously, but the surfaces on surviving net floats are remarkably smooth. The carvers achieved this by using the knife itself as a finishing tool. Once the sphere was true, they would hold the sloyd knife at a very high angle, nearly perpendicular to the surface, and draw it across the wood in a scraping action, rather than a cutting action. This is essentially the same principle as a card scraper, but executed with the carving knife. The thin shaving that comes off is almost translucent, and the surface left behind is burnished and compressed rather than torn the way sanding tears fibers. After scraping, many carvers would wet the sphere with water, let the raised grain dry, and then scrape again. This knocked down any fibers that would later stand up in use and gave a final surface that was genuinely glassy to the touch. Some floats were then rubbed with a smooth river stone or a piece of polished antler to further compress and seal the surface. For net floats specifically, this mattered because a smoother, denser surface absorbed less water, which meant the float stayed buoyant longer and lasted more seasons. The sixth thing I want to cover is the final step, boring the hole for the net line, because this is where a lot of otherwise beautiful sphere work gets ruined. The hole had to pass cleanly through the center of the sphere, parallel to the grain, without splitting the wood or pulling the sphere out of round. The tool was typically a spoon bit, a simple boring tool with a spoon-shaped cutting tip, rotated by hand using a T-handle or a simple bow drill. Some later carvers used a heated iron rod to burn the hole rather than cut it, which avoided splitting entirely, but required careful control to keep the bore centered. The trick I learned is that you start the bore from both ends. You mark the center point on two opposite poles of the sphere, drill halfway from one side, then flip and drill halfway from the other. If your center marks are accurate, the bores meet in the middle. This avoids the blowout that happens when a bit exits the far side of a sphere, and it keeps the bore straighter than trying to go all the way through from one side. Now, let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years. Things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for the lathe anytime something needs to be round. I did this for decades. If it was round, it went on the lathe. But a lathe is a spinning machine that removes material symmetrically around one axis. A sphere has no single axis. That is why lathe-turned spheres still require significant handwork to finish, and why many turners struggle with them. The Viking approach starts from the assumption that you are working in 3 dimensions from the very first cut, and the result is often better. The second pattern is trying to go from rough to round in one step. We want to skip ahead. We want to grab a gouge or a rasp and start rounding. But the geometric progression, square to octagon to 16 sides to sphere, is not just a tradition. It is a mathematical strategy that minimizes error at each stage. Every stage corrects the previous one, The third pattern is trusting measurement tools over your own eyes. I'm not saying throw away your calipers, but I spent years measuring things I should have been looking at. The light and shadow technique is not primitive. It is arguably more sensitive than a caliper for detecting surface irregularities on a curved form. The fourth pattern is sanding to fix surface problems instead of cutting cleaner. Every time I sanded a sphere, I was rounding over the facets, but also softening the geometry and raising torn fibers. The knife scraping method produces a fundamentally better surface with less effort. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is the shadow technique adapted for everyday shop use, and I have been using it for about 2 years now on everything from tenon shoulders to turned spindles. Whenever you need to check whether a curved or round surface is true, set it on your bench near a single light source, a window or a clamp-on shop light, and lower your eye level until you are looking across the surface at a very shallow angle. At that angle, any high spot or depression casts a shadow that is visible from several feet away. You do not need fancy gauges. You do not need to measure. The shadow tells you exactly where the problem is and how severe it is. I use this on round tenons to check for taper, on curved aprons to check for fairness, and on any spindle work when I want to verify that a shape is truly symmetrical. It takes about 5 seconds, and it has caught errors that my calipers missed because they only measure at discrete points while the shadow shows you the entire surface at once. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first right now. Link below. All right, let us continue. Those Viking net makers figured out something that took me 50 years and a museum trip to understand. You do not need a machine to make something round. You need a method, a sharp edge, and the patience to trust your own eyes. Try the progression on a scrap of birch this weekend. I think you will be surprised at what your hands already know how to do. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.